So, former police officer Derek Chauvin was just sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison for killing George Floyd. Accountability? Let's talk about that. Because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So, Judge Peter Cahill just sentenced former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin to 270 months, 22 and a half years in prison for murdering George Floyd. I am sure you all saw the videotape. George Floyd, an African-American citizen, alleged to have passed a fake $20 bill, who was handcuffed, put on the ground, held down, incapacitated by multiple police officers, and Derek Chauvin held his knee on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, executing George Floyd in broad daylight in front of many citizens, including children. And I think we are all asking ourselves now, is 22 and a half years in prison appropriate? Is it enough? Does it provide accountability? Does it provide justice? You know, I spent 22 of my 30 years as a homicide prosecutor trying cases in the courts of Washington, D.C., and watching today's sentencing hearing brought me right back to the hundreds of sentencing hearings in murder cases that I handled. And they are always emotional affairs. And rarely does everyone leave a sentencing hearing feeling fully satisfied with what went on. I readily admit that I was often swept up in the emotion. I shed a tear on more than one occasion during or after sentencing hearings. But I think it's appropriate to ask ourselves, given the nature of this crime, whether 22 and a half years is the right sentence, is appropriate. Now let me be clear, it is a serious and substantial sentence, spending more than 2 decades in prison. And I think Judge Cahill did the best he could to wrestle with all of the competing concerns and impose a sentence he believed was appropriate given the law and the facts of the case. But I think it's appropriate for us to ask some questions about the propriety of that sentence. So you can never reduce a sentence in a murder case to a simple math calculation. But looking at the numbers, I think, is instructive. So let's start with the average sentence for a second-degree murder under the guidelines in Minnesota. So the average guideline sentence for a second-degree murder for a first-time offender, and by that I mean somebody for whom this is their first conviction, I'm not saying this is the first thing Derek Chauvin did wrong as a police officer, but the average guideline sentence is 12.5 years, 12 and a half years. Judge Cahill went 10 years above that, and he said he went 10 years above it because there were aggravating circumstances that he found existed in this case. Let's talk about that. There were 4 aggravating circumstances that the court found were applicable to this case. 1, Derek Chauvin abused his position of authority as a police officer. 2, Derek Chauvin committed this crime in front of children, traumatizing them for the rest of their lives. 3, the manner in which he killed George Floyd was particularly cruel, atrocious, heinous, callous. And 4, he committed the crime with others, not just with others, with other police officers. 4 aggravating circumstances. So if we wanted to try to convert this into a math problem, starting with an average sentence of 12.5 years and going 10 years above that, that would work out to about 2.5 years for each one of those 4 aggravating circumstances. I think it's fair to ask the question whether 2.5 years for each of those 4 aggravating circumstances is really enough to hold Derek Chauvin accountable for what he did, enough to achieve some measure of justice. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. But we also know that Derek Chauvin is now facing a federal criminal civil rights trial. He's been charged by the federal government with violating George Floyd's civil rights. And if he is convicted in that case, any sentence that's handed down will likely be run consecutive to, that is, on top of, or as we say in D.C., sentences running wild, on top of, in addition to the sentence Judge Cahill imposed today. So at the end of this sad episode, Derek Chauvin may be looking at far more than 22.5 years in prison. And at least that will move things in the direction of justice. And justice matters. As always, folks, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.